Good evening, everyone. My name is Susan LaPerla. I'm the Director of Public Services for the Ferguson Library, and on behalf of our President, Ellis Knapp, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program. The Ferguson Library has been partnering with the Dylan Schneider Group for several years to bring you esteemed speakers of renown who have found a way to view the many aspects of our lives through the lens of civility. From the treatment of animals, to a life of public service, to ourselves on social media, each has had a unique perspective on the subject. And tonight, I'm sure you'll agree that it will be such a treat to listen to Melanie talk about the spirit of Thanksgiving to us tonight. And with that, I'd like Joe Pisani to come up. He represents the Dylan Schneider Group, and he will introduce Melanie to us.
Thank you, Susan. Well, as she said, we have a very special treat for you tonight. And I'm sure you'd all agree with me that after the election season we've had, all of us, regardless of your political persuasion, are looking forward to Thanksgiving. Let me commit heresy and say that my personal belief is that politics shouldn't be the most important thing in our lives. We have to be thankful for so many other things, our families, our friends, our faith, and that's what this talk is about tonight. Melanie is an award-winning author whose most recent book, as you have in your hand, is Thanksgiving, the Holiday at the Heart of the American Experience. And the publisher is even here tonight, Roger Kimball. Beautiful piece of work, and thank you, Roger and Melanie. She's acting op-ed editor of the Wall Street Journal and a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. She contributes reviews and commentary to various publications, including the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal. Her previous book was Escape from North Korea, The Untold Story of Asia's Underground Railroad. At the Wall Street Journal, Melanie was deputy editor of the editorial page and a longtime member of the editorial board. She was responsible for the editorial page's coverage of international issues, and she oversaw the opinion pages of the journal in Asia and Europe, the Far Eastern Economic Review, and the U.S. columnists on foreign affairs. During her career at the journal, she also oversaw the launch of opinionjournal.com and other online products. She managed the editing and production of books published by the journal and served as a member of the board of the Dow Jones Newspaper Fund. She spent 10 years in Asia working for the journal, Wall Street Journal Asia in Hong Kong, and before that, for a division of Time and Life Books in Tokyo. Melanie received a bachelor's degree from Princeton University and a master's degree in English from the University of Toronto. Please join me in giving her a very warm welcome.
Good evening. Let me be the first to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving. I think I can say that since it's just a little over a week away. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Joe, for your introductions, and a special thanks to the Dylan Schneider Group and Jan and Bob Dylan Schneider for putting together this marvelous series. I'd also like to acknowledge a couple of people who I'm very happy are here tonight. One is my husband, Jack David. We live in New Hartford, Connecticut, and Jack was and is my first editor, and I have to say my toughest editor. He doesn't let me get away with anything. So thank you, Jack, for all you did to help me with this book. I'd also like to acknowledge a very special person in my life, too, my sister, Holly Whiting, who's here from Dallas, and just happens to be here for a wedding, so with our friend Beth Gannell's daughter. And so she's here, and my book is dedicated to Holly and our sister Robin. And last but not least, I see several other friendly faces around the room, Paul, Bob, Peter, and I would especially like to take the opportunity publicly to give my thanks to Roger Kimball and Encounter Books for a magnificent job My book, of course, every author loves her writing, but I don't know if anybody's going to read my book. They're just going to look at the pictures. It's so pretty. And Roger and his team at Counter Books did a wonderful job of finding an author, finding an artist who really perfectly captures the sensibility of the book. And I appreciate, too, Roger and his team allowing me, the author, the word person, to work with the artist and book designer. This is not usual in the publishing world, I'm told. And somehow I think they trusted me not to be a problem, and I'm really happy with the way it worked out, and I thank them for it. Tonight, I thought I would start with speaking a little bit about how I came to write the book. On September 11th, 2001, I was in downtown Manhattan and watched the towers fall. I, like many Americans after that terrible attack, I began to think a little bit about what it means to be an American. And I began to read William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation. William Bradford was the longtime governor of Plymouth, and it's his journal of the journey from England to Holland, to the United States, to this continent on the Mayflower, and then the first decades in Plymouth. And it really blew me away. As Thanksgiving approached, I read ahead to his account of what has come to be known as the first Thanksgiving. And it struck me that those few words that he had to say about it really represented what we know as and how we celebrate the first Thanksgiving, with lots of feasting and lots of good fellowship, and most of all, lots of gratitude. So it's our oldest shared tradition as a people, going back to 1621. And the book, to give you a bit of an overview of it, I didn't write the book in a strictly chronological way. I jump around from century to century. For example, there's a chapter on Thanksgiving generosity and how the tradition of helping the less fortunate has been part of Thanksgiving for most of the history. I found an example from 1636 in Scituate, Massachusetts, where the richer folk are asked to take care of the poorer folk on Thanksgiving. And this is true today. You think of how we all go out to, either include people who are alone or can't go home, whatever, in our Thanksgiving dinners. And then in our wider communities, many of us participate in voluntary organizations to help the less fortunate, or we give money to them. And so then as the years progressed, I was at the Wall Street Journal, and as Joe pointed out, I was deputy editor, so I was in an enviable position. I would do a little bit of research on Thanksgiving, and they would publish my article. They indulged me in this interest, which I had a lot of fun with. And then when I retired from the Journal, I am back there for a few months right now, but when I retired from the Journal, this was one of the books I wanted to write. So my book is filled with lots of stories. There's a chapter on football, there's a chapter on dinner, of course, and there's a chapter about how the Pilgrims became associated with the holiday, and so forth. There's a chapter on people who don't celebrate the holiday, particularly some Native Americans. And but I thought that for this evening, since we all, except Holly, the Texan, are living here in Connecticut, I thought I would tell three stories that are set in Connecticut that have to do with the history of the holiday. And the first one I want to mention takes place in August 26th, 1639. In the colony of Connecticut. And Connecticut was the first of the colonies to name an annual day of Thanksgiving for general blessings. Thanksgivings were usually called by religious authorities in response to a specific beneficence, such as a good harvest, or a rain that came and saved a harvest, or a victory of some sort, either back in England or here over Native Americans. But Connecticut did something a little radical. It decided that it was going to issue a call for an annual Thanksgiving. Annual was unusual. And 2, they would do it for general blessings. And 3rd, it was the civil authorities that announced this Thanksgiving. And in August of 1636, they named a date in September where everybody in the colony was to celebrate a Thanksgiving. This was controversial, believe it or not, because as a religious matter, many people thought at the time that calling a Thanksgiving just for general blessings and continuing blessings was cheapening the idea of Thanksgiving, and it would encourage people to take God's generosity for granted. So it wasn't until the end of the 17th century, that Massachusetts finally gave way and issued a proclamation for Thanksgivings for general blessings. So that's the first one I wanted to mention. I will say that every colony had Thanksgivings, and the Pilgrims had a tradition of having a communal meal on a Thanksgiving day. So that, again, is kind of a link to what we do today. The second story I'll mention takes place during the Revolutionary War. And there is a marvelous letter that has come down to us from a young woman in Sharon, Connecticut, writing to her cousin in Boston and describing the Thanksgiving dinner. And I enclose I have a lot of readings in the book at the end. I'll come to that in a minute. But this letter I quote extensively from in the book because it's just so interesting. It took place in 1779, and first of all, because the war was raging, she writes to her cousin that we couldn't have any beef because all the beef went to feed the soldiers. So they had to make do with other things. The tradition was to have a kind of a meal of a lot of meats, different meats, and then side dishes. That would be one course, and then the second course would be dessert, and they would really go overboard with dessert. I think we can all relate to that. But so this was the Smith family, and the Smith family purchased a deer from local Indians, and that was their venison then was one of the mainstays of their dinner. And what else did they have? They also had a large cut or a chine of roast pork. Another table had a large roast turkey on it, and then they also had a roast goose. They also had a huge pigeon pie. And this, I will say, was very traditional in the form of chicken pie. Everybody in the 19th century in New England would appear to have, at least from what I could tell, would appear to have a chicken pie for Thanksgiving, as well as turkey and other things. And I had never heard of this tradition before, and when I was speaking a couple of weeks ago in our town of New Hartford, a woman spoke up and said that she was from Maine, and her family tradition was always to have a chicken pie the night before Thanksgiving. So it was, again, this tradition that has been handed down over the years. And there was an assortment of vegetables, she described in her letter, including one that the letter writer, Juliana, thought that her cousin had never heard of before. It was called celery. Spelled with an S, not a C. And she just said to her cousin, you eat it without cooking, and it is very good served with meats. For dessert, they had mince pie, pumpkin pie, apple tarts, Indian puddings, and suet puddings stood in for the traditional plum pudding, and it was made with a jar of West Indian preserved ginger that was left over from a shipment that the family had received before the Revolutionary War. Because during the war, American ports were blockaded by the British, and they couldn't get a lot of things that they were used to, such as wine. And so she describes how they couldn't have wine with Thanksgiving dinner. They had a few bottles left over, but they were saving it for people when they were sick. Instead, they had, where do they have? I think they had ale. Cider, by which I assume she means alcoholic cider. But there were other things in the letter that I also thought were very relevant to today. She describes who came to the dinner, and the dinner was held at her uncle's house. It was the uncle's turn and family to host the dinner, and they had 2 dining room tables, and they invited their neighbors who had recently moved to the area. They invited 3 old ladies who were alone in the world and had no place to go. They invited 5 orphans who were living in the area, and they were, I think, being tutored by the minister who was the letter writer's father. And so I know one of the saddest images in American culture, I think, is somebody with nowhere to go on Thanksgiving Day. And so, even then, there was this community spirit that you would invite the lonely, the people who perhaps couldn't afford their own dinner and things like that. And as we all know, and Beth is the one, my friend Beth, is the one who made me start thinking about this issue. Thanksgiving dinners are not always happy. There's some family dynamics or other dynamics that you sometimes have to think about. And Juliana Smith describes one in her letter to her cousin. She said that her grandmother thought that they should not have a Thanksgiving dinner because it was wartime and it would be inappropriate. And so she was against it. So the girl's father had to talk her into letting them have Thanksgiving. And then the third story I want to mention has to do with the Civil War. And I think, as many of you know, the first in the modern series of Thanksgiving proclamations took place in 1863. Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War, decided to call for a national Thanksgiving. Now, Lincoln and Jefferson Davis had both issued Thanksgiving proclamations earlier on in the war, and those were for military victories. But this Thanksgiving proclamation was something different. It was all about bringing Americans together. And Lincoln, in his proclamation, lists the things that we should be thankful for. And it was pointing the way to when the war would end and people could come together again. It was a very hopeful and a very poignant message. Why did Lincoln issue a Thanksgiving proclamation? And here I'm going to deviate a little bit from Connecticut. There was a woman named Sarah Josepha Hale who was one of the great editors of American history and also a great feminist. And she was born at the end of the 18th century in New Hampshire. She married late in life at the age of about 25. And had 4 kids and a 5th on the way when her husband died. She had no means of support, but so she started to write. She was highly educated thanks to her mother, who educated the kids at home, and then to her brother, who had gone to Dartmouth, and he would come home on weekends and would teach her everything he had learned at Dartmouth. And then her husband, who was a lawyer, would also teach her. In the evenings, they would read and discuss things by the firelight. So when he died, she started writing, and she was successful. She wrote a book called Northwood that was published in England, which was a great honor. And she got a job as editor of a magazine in Boston, a women's magazine. And she did something that other American editors were not doing. She began, it would seem an obvious thing, but she began to publish articles and fiction by American authors. Most magazines back then were reprints of articles that had appeared in English magazines and had come over and were, people would be waiting at the ships to get these magazines, and then they'd run off and republish them. There was no international copyright back then, and that's what Americans were reading. But Sarah Josepha Hale thought, and she was right, that Americans wanted to read about America. And so she was in Boston for a few years, and when she caught the attention of a rich publisher in Philadelphia who bought the magazine so that he could get Sarah Josepha Hale to edit his magazine, which is called Godey's Ladies Book. It became the first nationally circulated magazine, and she carried on the same tradition. She published Harriet Beecher Stowe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Edgar Allan Poe, among others. And Edgar Allan Poe paid her a great compliment. He called her a woman of masculine energy. So, anyway, so as part of her interest in Americana and things American, she loved the idea of Thanksgiving. She was a New Englander, and while colonies, the individual states, by then, and territories were beginning to celebrate their own Thanksgivings, this is because New Englanders would take the custom with them as they traveled to develop new, pioneers in new states. But she thought it would be a good idea for everybody to celebrate on the same day. So she began to publish editorials year after year after year calling for a national Thanksgiving, and she'd also run news articles listing the states that were going to have Thanksgiving and on what date. And in addition, she started a letter writing campaign, and she wrote hundreds of letters to prominent figures like politicians and lawyers and others, including all the presidents of the United States. And finally, in 1863, Lincoln heeded what she had to say, probably in part because his Secretary of State was William Seward. William Seward had been governor of New York and had known Sarah Josepha Hale and had issued his own Thanksgiving proclamations. What's the Connecticut connection? Well, there was, at the back of the book, there is a section called Readings for Thanksgiving Day. And these are short readings from Americans and one Brit, Winston Churchill, about Thanksgiving Day over 400 years of our history, including one from a Captain Andrew Upson of Southington, Connecticut. And he wrote a letter to his 4 children in Southington just before Thanksgiving Day in 1863, the date of the first national Thanksgiving. And it was about the meaning of Thanksgiving. And I'll just read you a little bit. He was away at war, and he wrote from Stevenson, Alabama. "My dear children, I suppose this letter will arrive at its destination about Thanksgiving Day. Hoping it may add to your happiness on that occasion, I sit up a few moments, although it is time to go to bed and everyone around is asleep. Perhaps, children, you do not understand the real meaning of Thanksgiving Day. In the first place, you have enough to eat." And he goes on to say that the people he sees in the South, many of them have very little to eat. The corn was it didn't grow because there wasn't enough rain, and then in other sections, harvests were destroyed by the army, and that was one thing that they should be grateful for. In the second place, you have a snug and quiet home. In this part of the country, families are often driven from their houses. They have to leave nearly everything and flee away to strange places. Oftentimes, women and their little ones are compelled to walk day and night. And he goes on. Then in the third place, you have books, papers, schools, and various privileges which thousands of children in other parts of the country know nothing about. It is a bad thing to grow up in ignorance. It is a bad thing where people do not go to meeting or have good books and maps and the means of acquiring knowledge. God has cast your lot where you have the benefit of almost every advantage to become learned and wise and useful. I hope you will so far understand this as to be thankful for your opportunities and not neglect them. And he concludes by saying, Papa sends his best wishes and tender affections to each of you and also to mother and grandmother from your loving father, Andrew Upson. 3 months later, he died from wounds that he had received in battle. But there's a little museum in Southington that has all of his letters home, and this was one of them, which I call to your attention when you have the moment. And I said I was going to only tell you 3, but I'll tell you one more quick story about Connecticut. And that is in the chapter on generosity, which I mentioned earlier. I spent a day at the Connecticut Food Bank in, it used to be in Waterbury. Where is it now? Wallingford, I think. And I was there to go through the training that the food bank gives to volunteers. And it was really, really interesting. And the group of volunteers I was with that day came from Prudential Securities in, where was it? Oh, I can't remember the town now. But this is the great tradition of American philanthropy. We are the most philanthropic people in the world, by far. The next highest, which I think is Canadians, give half as much as Americans do. This is as a per capita basis, I think. And this tradition is most closely felt at Thanksgiving, which is what those in the philanthropic community refer to as the start of the giving season. And I write about this tradition of generosity and how a lot of it comes from very small donations. Of course, we have a rich tradition of wealthy philanthropists who spend money to help people, but this is a real, at the poorest level, people give. And you can look at statistics that I have in the book. And I just think that is a remarkable feature of our society, which is on display, especially around this holiday. So, in closing, let me say a word about Thanksgiving Day this year. Joe indicated in his remarks about how we're all looking forward to Thanksgiving, especially. And, it's been a very divisive election season that we've all just gone through with a very ugly debate. And I think we should take the opportunity this Thanksgiving to remember what unites us, not what divides us. That's what Thanksgiving is all about. And, we also can have a little perspective on this as well. Remember in 1863, the first year of our Thanksgiving in the modern series of Thanksgivings, Americans were killing each other. It was the middle of the Civil War. And that we've come through difficult times, but our democratic institutions are strong, and we will see them in action in the years to come. So happy Thanksgiving, and I'd be very happy to take questions. Jack has just asked, I'll tell you about the second section at the back of the book. I don't like to call it an appendix because an appendix is such an off-putting word, but it's a historic recipes and bills of fare. And I think they really are only for the most adventuresome cook, but there are a few there that I plan to try. And it's fun to read about the context in which some of these recipes or menus were found. I found a menu, well, a bunch of menus in old newspapers. Did a lot of research in old newspapers, and around the beginning part of the 20th century, there were recipes in one newspaper for Thanksgiving dinner, including the traditional New England-style Thanksgiving dinner. But then it said, for those of you who don't have turkey pocketbooks, that is, couldn't afford a turkey, here are some more modest, less costly things you might like to have for Thanksgiving. So these recipes kind of tell a story, which I thought would be fun to include in the book. Yes, lady. There's...
You mentioned in your book that pies were made because they required less flour and they were easy. Oh, thank you. You mentioned in your book that pies were made because they required less flour and they could, easy to do. How did the pumpkin pie become the I guess the thing that everybody thinks about when they think about Thanksgiving next to turkey?
It's really hard to, or at least for me, to trace that. We know that the Wampanoag Indians planted pumpkins or squashes, and the Pilgrims could not have had pie because they didn't have any wheat flour. So there would have been no pie at the first Thanksgiving. There also would have been no cranberries because they didn't have sugar, and you can't eat cranberries without sugar, right? But the pie tradition, as I would read in histories of culinary histories, kind of grew up because they were very popular in England at the time, and they were a good way to. They were filling. And you could put anything in them, and people did. There's, I quote in one section from a novel from Harriet Beecher Stowe in the middle of the 19th century, in which she lists this amazing array of pies that they would make for Thanksgiving, including some I had never heard of. Some speculate that there was pumpkin at the first Thanksgiving, and one culinary historian talks about how the first pie might have been a hollowed out pumpkin that had stuff put in it and then was baked in their oven. But yeah, you're right. It's a New World vegetable, so that's another reason, of course. However, if you want to eat what the Pilgrims ate for Thanksgiving, you have to stock up on venison and corn and oysters and mussels, things that would have been available to them. Yes? There are a few other countries that have Thanksgiving days. They're not like ours. Brazil has one, and the reason it has one is that the Brazilian ambassador to the United States in the late 40s liked the holiday and took it home and led a campaign to start it there. There are a kind of harvest festival that are very popular in Korea and in China. But they really are just more about the harvest. They don't tell you anything about what it means to be Chinese or Korean. They're not associated with the history in that way. And Canada has a Thanksgiving Day, which is celebrated on our Columbus Day, usually. And it's a pretty, I should really look up the year it began. It's pretty modern, 20th century. But there's speculation that there were Thanksgivings in Canada prior to that. During the Revolutionary Revolutionary War, when Loyalists fled from the Boston and Plymouth area, a lot of them went to Halifax, and another seagoing community, and they think that they took the New England tradition of Thanksgiving with them there, but that's just speculation. Yes, and the lady in pink.
Hi, I have two questions. You mentioned that the Native Americans, Indians, didn't celebrate Thanksgiving. Did you?
Well, there's a chapter in my book about that, about their complicated attitude toward Thanksgiving. The bottom line is that, from what I could tell, most Native Americans do celebrate Thanksgiving, but for many, there's also it's a bittersweet holiday because even though the first Thanksgiving was a peaceful time, we all know what followed. And so there is one group in New England who protest every Thanksgiving Day in Plymouth, and that's been going on since the 1970s.
My second question is, do you have the knowledge of the first Thanksgiving Day parade?
Oh, I don't write about that in the book. I decided you can only write about so many things, but the parade tradition, New York City had a parade tradition whereby communities, neighborhoods would get together and they would march or parade on Thanksgiving Day, and children would dress up as ragamuffins, and it was kind of a trick-or-treat experience. They would go off and beg pennies from people. But then the first big parade started with the department stores in New York and Philadelphia in the early part of the 20th century.
I am dating myself, but I was one of the ragamuffin children in New York City. My mother sent us out on Thanksgiving Day. I just saw it in the Times, and I thought that's what it was about, because we thought she's crazy. And we knocked on somebody's door, and they gave us these liquor candies because they didn't know what else to do.
Well, it was the tradition supposedly died out in the 1940s, but it became controversial. In the Depression, people didn't like the idea that kids were being taught to beg, and the head of the department, the schools, what's it called, chancellor of schools, came down against it. The police, apparently somebody passed a law against it, and so but most of all, there was societal pressure that it was not good to teach children how to beg. Very different attitudes back then. Bob. Wait for the mic.
Oh, Mike.
Thank you.
With about 24 hours of broadcast football and the stores open to start the season, is the tradition in danger?
No, it's not. I really don't think it is at all. Although there have been controversies over this ever since football started in the 19th century, and there's a chapter devoted to football, and it talks about some of the soul searching that went on as people thought, is football taking away from the true meaning of the holiday, which is gratitude, just as we've accepted football, and now we think about, is shopping taking away from the true meaning of the day? I don't mind Black Friday. I think that it's, on a positive note, it's an example of our prosperity, and that we're out there buying gifts. And also, as I mentioned earlier, Americans are the most generous people, and the more money we have, the more we give away. So, and I would also mention there's a new tradition called Giving Tuesday, which is an online collaboration to encourage people to give money in the spirit of Thanksgiving, the Tuesday after the holiday. And finally, while there are a few people who, want the holiday to go the way of Columbus Day, that's not and these people are, as you might expect, mostly in the universities. I couldn't find many of them, and nobody seems to want to pick up on their attitudes because, everybody loves the holiday too much. It's a time to be with family and eat a great meal. So I don't think we're going anywhere. The big change over 400 years is in how we express thanks. And it used to be within memory of many of us that people would go to a house of worship on Thanksgiving Day. And today, that's less prevalent, and it'd be hard to find a house of worship that was open on Thanksgiving Day, probably, but there are services during the week, often. And here's an interesting thing. There was a study a couple of years ago asking people if they said grace before a meal, and 44% of the respondents said yes, and another 44% said on special days we say grace. So that adds up to 88% of Americans, and I think Thanksgiving certainly qualifies as a special day. So that's probably the biggest change, though. Yes.
Here we go.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, thank you so much for being here and giving this talk. It's wonderful. I love Thanksgiving. But I'm interested in the people that are serving in our military overseas. Is it celebrated on every base, everywhere for our soldiers?
Yes, it is. At least every soldier, so the Defense Department says, gets a Thanksgiving dinner. In certain conditions, it won't necessarily be on Thanksgiving Day. I think in the reading section, I have a description from a book on the Korean War, where I think I included it, where the soldiers would come in from fighting, and they would save Thanksgiving dinners for them. But the tradition of making sure the military got a good meal was, originally the private sector. The people would gather together to make sure that they had meals, and but since I guess the end of since World War I at least, the military has done that, and also for their families. There are a lot of charities that help families have good meals on Thanksgiving Day.
I have a question about music for Thanksgiving. Besides Jingle Bells, which I understand is originally a Thanksgiving song back when we used to have snow at Thanksgiving time, have you run across any other popular songs that people used to sing around Thanksgiving that we could try to bring back?
Well, they're hymns. One of the titles one of the working titles of my book was "We Gather Together," after the old hymn, which actually has its origins in Holland in the 17th century. But I'm not aware of any popular songs about Thanksgiving. It's a good idea.
Over the river and through the woods.
Oh, of course. How could I forget that? Yes, of course. Over the river and through the woods. Sorry, yes, you're right. And that was written by Lydia Maria Child, and the original title was A New England Boy's Christmas, I think. But we all know it by the first line. So, yeah, there's that.
I could be wrong on this, but I have a totally useless historical fact I want you to check me on. And I'll leave before you come up with the answer. The woman that you referenced that lobbied Lincoln and others and really is in many ways responsible for the first national Thanksgiving was also very well known for a song that she wrote.
Right.
That song, I think, is Mary Had a Little Lamb.
Exactly. Yeah.
Useless, but interesting.
Yeah.
We all know it.
It is interesting, and it's kind of a shame that she's remembered for that, and instead of some of the other things she did, such as she was behind the first public playground, which was in Boston. She led a campaign for married women to have control of their own finances. She supported Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first female doctor teacher in the United States, and she did many other things along those lines. But Mary Had a Little Lamb was hers too. Well, yes, Holly. Oh, wait for the mic, please.
Okay. In your introduction, you talk about your visit to the newcomer school.
Oh, yeah.
And my question is, do you feel that educators are teaching Thanksgiving well enough to modern American students today, or is it too much fluff?
Well, most high schools don't teach Thanksgiving, from what I could tell. Newcomers High School is in Queens, which is probably the most heavily immigrant community in America. Almost 50% of people who live in Queens come from another country. And Newcomers High School is a public city high school for their children, and they learn English, and they either graduate from Newcomers, or if their English is good enough, they go on to another school and graduate. And I went there to interview them about what Thanksgiving meant. And these kids, their teachers had decided that because they were immigrants, they really should know about Thanksgiving, even though it wasn't part of the New York State curriculum. And these kids were great. They had a real personal understanding of what it meant. My favorite, well, there's so many. One of the most meaningful stories was a boy who raised his hand and said that he was from Tibet, a country that hasn't existed since 1950, when China overtook it. But he said he and his family were like the Pilgrims. They came to this country so that they could practice their own religion, which was the religion of the Dalai Lama, Buddhism. So those kids really had a personal understanding. There is, if you look at, I looked at some online materials for high school students about Thanksgiving, and I found one website that goes with Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, with a lot of supplementary material about Thanksgiving, and it was full of garbage, basically. It didn't even have some facts straight, but it presented Thanksgiving in a false way. In elementary schools, Thanksgiving is taught, and actually, my book is one of the few books on Thanksgiving for anybody over the age of 8, and there are lots of kids' books about it. But the Native Americans I spoke to were unified, for the most part, in saying that they really disliked the way it was taught in most elementary schools, that the Indian story was presented in incorrect and stereotypical ways. For example, the wearing of feathers in Indian culture is sacred, and it carries meaning. And a lot of kids' pageants, you'll see kids in these big headdresses, which the Indians of New England never wore anyway. Those were out west. And sometimes the stories are not fully explained. Like, you've all heard of Squanto, the Native American who taught the Pilgrims how to plant corn and help them in other ways. Well, it sounds great, and he was great. He was a great friend to the Pilgrims, and when he died, he left his few possessions to them. There was a great connection between them. But the backstory is that Squanto had twice been kidnapped by fishing boats that came from England to New England, and taken to England first, and the second time to Spain, where they sold him to a group of priests who then helped him get to England. And in both cases, he was able to find passage working on ships that came back to this area. And so that's a real tragic story. And when he got here, he discovered that all his family and friends had been killed by an illness that some historians think may have been yellow fever, but in any case, they were all dead. So you can understand why Native Americans would like to have the story more fully told. Yes, actually, we haven't had a question from this gentleman, and then I'll come to you.
You lived outside the United States for quite a number of years. What was Thanksgiving like for you?
Oh, well, the first challenge was finding a turkey in Tokyo and in Hong Kong. The second challenge was finding an oven that most apartments didn't have ovens. Asian cooking does not involve ovens. But every year, my friends and I usually managed. But Thanksgiving, Sarah Josepha Hale wrote that Thanksgiving, one of her goals was that Thanksgiving should be celebrated wherever Americans go around the world. And my experience was that it is, that it's very much a time for Americans to get together and, very eclectic groups and celebrate our holiday, often on a Saturday instead of a Thursday, especially if the cooks have to work that day. Yes, sir?
One more? Here you go.
Okay, this is the last one.
Is devoting a specific day of Thanksgiving unique to the United States?
There are, Canada, Brazil, China, Korea have days of Thanksgiving, but they're not really the same as ours in that they're not freighted with the history that we have. So it's just, in most cases, a time to celebrate the harvest. And then there is a religious aspect to it in some of the European countries as well. Thank you. Oh, one more? Okay, one more.
I'm very impressed that you've tied Thanksgiving to obviously to philanthropy, and I remember years ago reading several books on American philanthropy, but has there been a really updated one that might have? I'm anxious to read your book in terms of the warmth, and I would, living in this community all my life, and I've seen so many 1%ers or even half percenters quietly give many times in different ways in our communities. And there's, we all talk, or not we all, I have a business that sells to 1%ers and the new 1%ers, the quote new money that read the Wall Street Journal, they want to give money back. They really do. Sometimes they don't know how to do it. They don't know where to give it. But there's a story behind this that I think would be, if you'd like to write another book, I think that would be the one you should write.
Yeah, there's a wonderful organization called Philanthropy Roundtable, which is run by Adam Meyerson, who many years ago wrote the manager's, or edited the manager's journal column for the Wall Street Journal, which is one reason I know him. But it's for, you have to give away, I can't remember how much it is, a certain amount of money in order to be part of this, so it's high end. And they also have a magazine called Philanthropy Today, which describes a lot of the philanthropies that individual wealthy people have either started or are involved with. You might take a look at that. Thank you.
Melanie, thank you so much. Thank you. We wish you a happy Thanksgiving. We also wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, because we're not going to resume until January 17th with George Bodenheimer of ESPN, who will talk about civility in the world of sports. And Melanie, thank you for putting us in the spirit of the season early.